we gotta get into some news that I feel has to be some of the biggest bombshells I've seen dropped on the Dragon Ball community in a long time, likely since the passing of the GOAT Akira Toriyama sensei himself. Let me rap with y'all for a bit on a translated interview that popped up on my page, taken from Koso J-Wave, in an interview conducted with editors from the Dragon Ball franchise who shed some light as well as firmly debunked some of the longest running questions and myths that have been floating around for no joke what's gotta be decades at this point. Big ups to Venixis on Twitter because it is the direct translations from his page I'm going to be reading from, and their work on this is big time appreciated. So with no further delay, let's talk about some of this wisdom that got dropped on our heads. During the final phase of the Cell Saga, Toriyama repeatedly expressed his intention to end Dragon Ball with that narrative arc. Initially, those who heard him did not fully understand his will, thinking that even if the Cell Saga was concluded, the series could continue in another way. However, strong pressure came from the editorial team for the story to go on, pushing Toriyama to continue further. Despite this, Takeda always sided with the author, trying to find ways to ease his workload and make the continuation of the series less burdensome. In the end, both Toriyama and Takeda insisted that the story should definitively conclude with the end of the Majin Buu saga, out of respect for Toriyama and his desire to bring the series to a close. So that long-standing rumor about when Dragon Ball was supposed to be going up in smoke has finally been confirmed, which is so nuts to me because that's something the fan base has been going back and forth on for so long. So now we finally have concrete knowledge that Toriyama Sensei really did want things to end with the passing of the torch to Gohan, but after opposition from the editors, they negotiated one last arc, and out of that was born the Majin Buu saga. It is so wild to think how many character and narrative moments that would never have existed if it weren't for Toriyama's willingness to work with his homie Takeda and others to go on one last ride. No Buu Saga means no Super Saiyan 3, no fusions, no Majin Vegeta moment, no real resolution of Vegeta's character arc, and just how many of Mr. Satan shenanigans we would have missed out on. Absolutely insane piece of news to start this interview off. Alright, let's dive into more. During the final phase of Dragon Ball, Toriyama was asked if he truly enjoyed designing new characters, to which he replied that he actually preferred creating rounder, cuter figures with a humorous touch. This reflection led to the idea of creating a villain with those characteristics, Majin Buu. As the Buu saga took shape, Toriyama kept insisting that the series should have ended earlier. However, despite this, Toriyama seemed to be having a lot of fun working on it. This was particularly evident in the absurd gags reminiscent of early Toriyama, such as Gotenk's Ghost Kamikaze attack, which left the editor both astonished and perplexed. But it was clear that the sensei was enjoying this final part precisely because he knew the story was coming to an end. This part here makes so much sense, and it's something that we actually had a chance to chop it up about for all my homies that's been on this ride with me since the Z recaps. I remember talking about how the Buu saga gives big OG Dragon Ball vibes, and that was absolutely no accident. It looks like Toriyama Sensei, despite being burnt out at first, ended up really loving the Buu arc and was able to tap back into his love of the game and just have fun drawing. And you can feel that in the humor, fourth wall breaks, and sheer absurdity of the Buu saga. It looks like Toriyama has been able to tap back into what made him love writing and drawing in the first place, and you can feel it in that saga of Dragon Ball Z. Towards the end of the Cell Saga, Toriyama had probably intended to conclude Dragon Ball within a few weeks, perhaps 3 or 4. However, the series continued for another 2.5 years. He might have thought of wrapping everything up in 6 months, but the story ended up lasting much longer than expected. Rather than convincing him to continue, the editors focused on finding ways to make the work more enjoyable for him. Their approach was more along the lines of, let's try adding something fun to this arc so he can enjoy it a bit. A key example of this was Mr. Satan. The idea of making him central and exaggerating his stupidity was introduced specifically to add a comedic element that could lighten the tone. And ironically, in the end, he was the one who saved the world. Bruh, can y'all imagine the Buu saga being wrapped up in just 2 weeks? Like, what would that have even looked like? What would have been left out? The fact that it went from being 2 weeks to 2.5 damn years showed just how much Toriyama Sensei found himself loving what he was doing, and again, just to get to mess around with Buu as a character and not having the entire arc center around straight battle after battle. This interview continues to explode my brain, but let's keep it pushing. Previously, under Kondo's management, the structure of the series was clear. A powerful new villain was introduced, leading to an epic showdown with Goku. But after repeating this pattern with Frieza and Cell, Toriyama seemed to grow tired of this type of storytelling. He felt that he had already given enough in terms of battles and ruthless antagonists, which is why the Majin Buu saga took on a more comedic tone, resembling Dr. Slump in style. The shift in tone was, in a way, inevitable. The Cell Saga had become increasingly complex with time travel and paradoxes, creating a difficult narrative structure to manage. If a mistake was made in the chronology, it became nearly impossible to correct it without generating further inconsistencies. As the story progressed, it became evident that things had gotten more and more tangled. So this goes right into what we were just talking about with Toriyama himself getting sick of that formula that had developed in Z and getting back into a slump bag. Cool to hear about that being a deliberate shift though, with him and the editors acknowledging that the introduction of the drink and that time machine-ish opening up Pandora's box and leading to just straight up inconsistencies that would be impossible to reconcile. As a result, the Majin Buu saga became a sort of reaction to that excess complexity. Toriyama and the editors decided to remove the narrative complications. No more paradoxes, no more intricate logic. Instead, they opted for a simpler, lighter structure filled with gags. In hindsight, this was probably the best choice to conclude the series in a freer and more enjoyable way. During a conversation, Toriyama was asked whether he actually enjoyed drawing certain characters. He replied that Kondo had always told him that if a character wasn't cool, it wasn't good enough. At that point, the discussion shifted to Frieza, revealing that he was actually a forced character, one that Toriyama hadn't particularly wanted to create but was made to include. However, when the story undergoes sudden changes, such as when Toriyama himself requested to move on to a new opponent because he no longer wanted to draw Frieza, it can complicate the plot structure and lead to somewhat chaotic situations. Insane reveal here. What do you mean we almost never got Frieza as a character? Man is by far my favorite racist in fiction, sitting right next to Uncle Ruckus from Boondocks.
Well, how do you do, Lord Frieza? I always knew the Emperor of the Universe was a white man. Now let's rid the universe of these monkeys and them Saiyans too.
I had no idea Sensei Toriyama did not mess with a character like that. Him getting smoked the way he did by Future Trunks now makes so much sense, it's unreal. In the end though, Toriyama's mind always finds a way to keep a story moving. Often, when reorganizing the narrative, it may seem like certain ideas came from him or someone else, but in reality, it's just a process of simplification and adjustments exactly as Kondo has suggested. Therefore, it's important to be mindful of how certain narrative changes are interpreted. It's often said that Kondo shut down the idea of Cell, declaring that it was all worthless, but in reality, things didn't go exactly that way. It wasn't a complete rejection, but rather a critique of the character designs. Initially, Cell had an appearance very similar to a large cicada-like insect, and Kondo expressed some doubts. He didn't seem like a particularly cool opponent. However, when the character took on a more humanoid form, the judgment changed. The design felt more fitting, more charismatic, and better suited for an exciting battle. This is mad cool to hear as well, because I know of 1,000% heard the rumors about the in-house issues between Toriyama and editors about Cell's design and how many issues that caused. Much like everything in life, it looks like things were more nuanced than that, with Kondo being critical of some of the specifics of the design and wanting to rework things in a way where a showdown with Goku could be more exciting for readers and watchers. Big respect to Toriyama for the lack of ego and being willing to make the changes his editors on his team suggested. Ego kills so many good things before they start, homies. Being the kind of person that can hear critique and really integrate it without getting overly salty and butthurt will straight up change your life. Specifically when it comes from well-meaning people with the same goals as you. Because real talk, you gotta be wary of whose advice you're listening to out here. Not everybody wants to see you win or even cares about you. Mad respect to Toriyama, not just for his artistic ability, but the mental strength it would take to keep a franchise like this successful as well. The idea was that an antagonist that was too monstrous wouldn't engage the audience as much as one with a more human-like appearance. This observation was based on direct experience with Dragon Ball. For example, during the Great Ape transformation, it was initially believed that a battle featuring a giant monkey would excite readers. However, in reality, popularity polls plummeted. The conclusion, as Kondo emphasized, was clear. The audience found fights between humanoid opponents of similar size more compelling because they created greater tension and engagement. P.S. Ironic considering that the final villains of Dragon Ball would eventually end up being giants. I had no idea his ratings tanked off of Zoro and giant battles. That's nuts. But that again shows the importance of listening to feedback, right? Like imagine if Toriyama, due to pridefulness, just kept doing the same things over and over, never taking other points of view into account, and how little of the franchise we know as Dragon Ball would come to fruition at that point. It also makes me think about that reality in video games too. Stuff like Devil May Cry, where battles against Virgil and people of similar sizes are always way more hype than just these giant monster battles. Kinda insane to think about. The idea of Frieza as a space merchant and galactic villain emerged during a brainstorming session, but at first, there was no clearly defined character. The concept of an intergalactic evil businessman was strong and universal because it immediately established his role, a ruthless villain. In Dragon Ball, clear-cut roles work best. The good guys are good, the bad guys are bad. Toriyama was never inclined to create intricate plots with double crosses and elaborate twists. Instead, he would drop hints without developing complex backstories. His storytelling style was simple and direct, aimed at a young audience, without excessive flashbacks or long-term mysteries to unravel. When a plot needed a twist, he often introduced new ideas suddenly. For example, the revelation that Goku was a Saiyan wasn't the result of an elaborate plan, but a narrative necessity. When the story hit a roadblock, Toriyama quickly found a solution. Bro, this being the reality of Goku's origin is flooring. So much of what Dragon Ball now hinges on is the reality of Goku being a Saiyan from outer space. And the fact that Toriyama just cooked this up on a whim, but not only that, found a way to fit this within the narrative structure of the rest of the series, and even coherently connecting to the series past that was established before this was made, no one will ever be able to tell me that his brain wasn't working off some kind of 4D chess generator. And I also like this because it shows Toriyama Sensei's intention from the start with simplicity. I truly don't think it was a matter of capability or talent. He wanted Dragon Ball from moment one to be appealing to his target audience, young Japanese boys. And with that goal in mind, he made the story direct and easy to follow. But the consequence of that philosophy just so happened to be that the appeal was universal. Nearly anybody from any place could find something to relate to in the story of Goku and company. Creating something with this kind of broad appeal is something only the smallest group of creators on the planet will ever be able to do. This method led to unexpected surprises, such as the destruction of Namek. At that point, a problem arose. If the planet was gone, then the Dragon Balls would be too. But the solution came immediately with the introduction of another Namekian who could recreate them. The spontaneity defined the entire creative process. There was no long-term planning. Toriyama and the editors would decide on the general direction and then develop the story week by week. Even the idea of setting part of the story in space emerged suddenly. If Goku was an alien, then it made sense to explore new planets. Iconic elements like Goku's tail were not originally conceived as part of his Saiyan heritage, but were later tied into it when the story required. This approach also influenced the structure of the martial arts tournaments. To hear confirmation that this decade-spanning series really operated from week to week like this, I swear Toriyama and those editors were the poster children of being able to live in the moment and not stress. He was really taking this massive legacy-defining work one pencil and brushstroke at a time. Massive lesson in that. In a typical setup, the strongest fighters will face off in the finals, but in Dragon Ball, the decisive duel could happen in the first round. This often left the editors confused. What happens after that? But Toriyama, true to his philosophy, would simply respond, if I put the most epic fight first, I'll just come up with something else. His priority was just to surprise the reader, create something unexpected, and not worry too much about long-term consequences. This ability to subvert expectations and improvise solutions made his storytelling fresh and unpredictable. His goal wasn't to build a perfectly structured plot, but to surprise and entertain, always leaving readers eager to see what would happen next. Proof Toriyama never lost sight of the ball. His clarity on what he wanted Dragon Ball to be was insane. While it definitely took some twists and turns, he always managed to keep the essence of it. He kept Dragon Ball fun, unpredictable, and never let himself or the story get bogged down by anxiety or the weight of what he was doing. I promise y'all, I'm gonna be chewing on this interview and thinking about what all this means for a long time to come. Crazy thankful we got this kind of insight. During the Buu Saga, there was a moment when Toriyama decided to experiment with a different idea, the school chapter, featuring Gohan in high school and Great Saiyan Man. The idea was to try a lighthearted storyline, with Gohan attempting to hide his identity while experiencing small, everyday adventures. However, after a few weeks, Toriyama got bored and abruptly abandoned it. As often happened, if something became too complicated or unstimulating, he would drop it without much hesitation. The school setting required many crowded scenes filled with background characters, something Toriyama found tedious and time-consuming to draw. So to make the work simpler and more enjoyable for himself, he quickly cut that storyline and moved on to something more dynamic and absurd. This tendency toward improvisational storytelling is also evident in the introduction of Trunks. I'm in tears. Toriyama was for real out here following his heart. This is also cool because it debunks some previous things I heard about the editors forcing him to find a villain because the Gohan high school chapters were not it. It sounds like the Goat himself just got bored of the concept, got sick of drawing all those damn crowds and was like, screw it, let's get Goku back in here. I'm crying, man. He really followed his instincts to a degree I feel like you rarely see in a person. When Trunks first appeared, effortlessly wiping out Frieza, no one, not even Toriyama, had decided who exactly he was. There was no long-term plan for him to be the son of Vegeta or Bulma. It was only later that Toriyama made the connection and was declared, okay, Bulma marries Vegeta. For the editors, this was a complete shock. Up until that point, Bulma had shown no particular interest in Vegeta, so the revelation that they would have a child left them stunned. Some suggested the relationship should be explained in more detail, but Toriyama, in his usual spontaneous style, brushed it off with a casual, más o menos. This was his philosophy. Don't overplan. Introduce ideas suddenly, and if something becomes inconvenient or boring, change it on the spot. His goal was always to surprise the reader while also making his own work as simple as possible. Oh nah, I gotta come up for air for a minute. What you mean Big Dog hadn't decided who the hell Trunks was ahead of time? Man, it's like Toriyama really designed this whole ass character with a time travel gimmick with zero idea who this fellow was even beforehand. Just out here operating off of whimsy and vibes. And yet again, he made that ish work. Bro, I can't imagine how many cigarettes he had those poor fellas in the office down in. Toriyama was actually a different breed, literally one of one. The working process with Toriyama was quite unique compared to other mangaka. Manuscripts were sent via fax, but not as simple storyboards to be corrected. They were already nearly final. The editors would receive them, take a look, and generally approve them without too many changes. If they asked what would happen in the next chapter, the answer was always the same, who knows, we'll see next week. Toriyama wasn't the type to do multiple drafts or engage in lengthy discussions or revisions. Unlike other authors who worked closely with editors to refine and adjust the story, he trusted his own creative process, worked independently, and delivered the final product without wanting to revisit it. However, editors like Torishima and Kondo were much stricter. If something didn't work, they wouldn't hesitate to send it back to the drawing board with the firm Zinzendame! Absolutely not. Takeda, on the other hand, took a different approach. I actually cracked up reading this one. He was really one take Tori out here, but his editors were quick to hit him with a hell no if they thought he was bugging when he was dropping these freestyles. I would die to see some of the original drafts he dropped on them that made them yell out loud to get his ass back in the kitchen and cook up some real ass food. But once again, we go right back to how much Toriyama trusted his creative instincts and was not about making his life any harder than it needed to be. I'm really gonna marinate on the way Big Dog was moving out here. Knowing that Toriyama wanted to end the series, Takeda's goal was to make things as easy as possible for him, avoiding excessive pressure. But the recurring challenge remained. Okay, this chapter is done, but what about next time? What's gonna happen? This constant uncertainty was the real struggle for the Dragon Ball editors, as Toriyama's creative process was completely instinctive and unpredictable. Toriyama really had his editors out here with the psychiatrist and a Xanax prescription on speed dial. Buddy is a planner and organizer's worst nightmare. The transformation of Dragon Ball into a battle manga happened gradually, but not entirely by chance. In its early stages, the series balanced adventure, comedy, and combat, but with the arrival of the Saiyan Saga, the focus shifted more and more towards battles, pushing the story into prolonged, high-intensity action. This change was driven by the audience's response. Readers were thrilled by the fights and wanted to see more. Toriyama, initially more interested in adventure comedy, hadn't planned this shift from the start. However, once he experimented with it, he found it fun to develop increasingly spectacular and elaborate battles. It wasn't just a matter of let's introduce a new enemy and have him fight Goku. There was an evolution in character dynamics, as demonstrated by Vegeta's arc. Another really cool piece of confirmation was just how organic the change in the series was. Big respect for Toriyama for keeping his ear to the ground and engaging with the audience, and also being so willing to get out of his comfort zone and take the series into a direction he hadn't intended. Instead of running from the challenge, he saw it as an opportunity to challenge himself and go a different route, and because of that, really has become the face of an entire genre that's absolutely saturated to this day. Initially, the main antagonist, Vegeta, eventually joined the protagonist when Frieza's threat emerged. This kind of development enriched the narrative, moving beyond simple villain of the arc structures and creating more complex interactions between characters. The editorial team debated whether the former enemy-turned-ally formula would work, and they eventually realized it added depth to the story. Toriyama himself, though he didn't plan everything far in advance, let himself be guided by audience reactions. He wasn't the type to obsess over popularity polls, but when results were shared with him, his competitive spirit drove him to improve. Despite his image as a laid-back person, Toriyama actually had a strong competitive nature. Makeru Girai, hates to lose. This aspect of his character pushed him to create increasingly impressive fight scenes, never settling for less. Toriyama sensei really had that Mamba mentality before it was even a thing. I messed with the fact that he wasn't driven strictly by popularity polls though. It was more so the fact that he wanted to see just how much he could outdo himself in the work he had previously done that propelled him to push his limits. It's wild how much of his personal philosophy found its way into the character of Goku, as well as the teachings of the Turtle Hermit School. This really makes me want to do more research about the man behind the pen. I really wonder how much he was into martial arts himself, or even like Zen and Buddhist teachings, because the way he carried himself and moved around in the world makes it feel like there was a real deeply ingrained philosophy that made him do the things he did. So even though Dragon Ball wasn't exactly the manga he had originally dreamed of drawing, once he embraced that direction, he gave it his all to make it the best it could be. About 10 years ago, when the idea of doing something new with Dragon Ball was proposed, Toriyama responded with little enthusiasm, saying he didn't find it fun anymore. He didn't feel obligated to continue, but the motivation that had driven him in the past was no longer there. Even in a tribute interview on the radio, he admitted that he no longer felt the same excitement as before. Sure, he still enjoyed working with certain characters, but his engagement wasn't what it used to be. During the Buu Saga, or even towards the end of the Frieza saga, that creative spark was still evident. He was full of ideas and energy. Over time, however, the subtle changes in storytelling became noticeable, signaling that their approach was shifting and that his inspiration was no longer as strong. This might be disheartening to some, but I actually feel motivated by it. How many people, and especially successful people or industries, just don't know when to let a thing die? Some people struggle so hard to hold on to the success of the past, doing everything they can to milk every bit of life out of something that was once wonderful for the sake of greed and popularity. Yeah, I'm looking at you kind of sideways, Star Wars.
What?
I'm alone.
Solo.
It was rare to find someone who was so thoroughly dedicated to being true to their vision in the way that Toriyama Sensei was. Despite the vast success the franchise had in the past and the fact that there was a million more to be made, he wanted to honor both himself and the work he created by letting the series rest where he felt it was most appropriate. And how many people can really say they got that kind of integrity inside of them? Hell of a person, man. The relationship between Toriyama, Katsuda, and their editor Torishima was built over time, marked by moments of tension but also deeply mutual respect. When Katsuda recounted past episodes where it seemed like Toriyama had endured some editorial harshness, Toriyama himself would react with surprise, saying, "Oh really, that happened?" Only realizing later how tough those moments might have been. Over time, Toriyama and Katsuda developed a deep understanding of each other. Having both worked under Torishima, they shared similar experiences, and although they occasionally complained about his decisions, it was more about recalling anecdotes and harboring any real resentment. In fact, the fact they spoke about him negatively wasn't out of bitterness. It was actually proof of the profound impact he had on their lives. I can relate to this heavy. I know for a fact I have some people in my life that I complain about, but in reality it's out of the appreciation I've learned to develop for the influence they had in my life now that I'm years removed and able to see the situation more clearly. It takes a powerful relationship to be able to battle back and forth like that, be brutally honest with one another, and still have it stand the test of time. These fellas sound like they were really in the trenches together. The more they discussed his absurd directives, the more it became evident that Torishima had left a lasting imprint on their artistic journeys. It was kind of affection disguised as critique, a way of acknowledging his importance without openly admitting it. After all, these weren't stress-induced outbursts or genuine complaints, but rather a form of long-standing trust. Katsuda and Toriyama, despite moments of frustration, would never disown Torishima's crucial role in their careers. On the contrary, the fact they spoke about him so often was proof of just how much they respected and appreciated him. That's what I'm talking about. It's that big brother energy. I might call him a piece of shit and talk about him crazy, but I'll be damned I'll let anybody else around me do it, especially when you don't know that dude like I do and know the storms we have gone through together. It sounds like on the surface, you got all these third-party people that really thought they knew what was up between Toriyama and the rest of the crew, but in real life, the bond was way deeper than that, and the people on the outside really couldn't even begin to know it. At Jump's editorial office, we tried to synchronize the weekly serialization of the manga with the release of the collective volumes, the anime, merchandise, and video games. Every week, there were meetings with companies like Bandai and game developers who asked us to plan product launches around key moments in the story. However, Toriyama didn't work with a fixed schedule and often responded with a vague, I haven't really decided on all the details yet. This made the coordination difficult because if he suddenly decided to change the direction of the story, the anime, merchandise, and video game plans had to be adjusted in a hurry. Sometimes we get panic calls like, hey, what do we do now? Even the covers of the collective volumes, Tankobon, and their content influenced the merchandising strategy. For example, if a certain character was chosen for the cover, but Bandai might plan to release a figure based on them, but if Toriyama suddenly changed his mind about that character, the entire release schedule was shift. Coordinating the weekly serialization, the anime, the Tankobon, and the merchandise was almost an impossible task. Dragon Ball was so popular that requests for collaborations and new products kept piling up. Sometimes the editors wondered if they were still working as editors or had become video game planners instead. Despite the challenges, seeing Dragon Ball expand in so many directions was incredible. Going right back to Toriyama really being the antithesis of a sellout. Man was out here putting merchandiser and these companies through hell trying to keep up with the story so they could drop Funko Pops, games, and all that assorted stuff. Most folks are out here sacrificing their wife and firstborn for deals with some of these big names. And you had Toriyama out here refusing to give them even the most vague answers because he needed a nap and was still figuring out whether he wanted Vegeta to die or not. Once again, y'all, a different breed. Occasionally, depending on Bandai's needs, there were discussions about whether a particular character should get more screen time at that moment or not. Conversely, whether their appearance should be delayed to avoid spoilers. With everything developing in parallel to serialization, predicting the timing with precision was practically impossible. For a Jump anniversary, the editorial team came up with a crazy idea, stacking all the issues of the magazine until they reached 25 meters in height using a fire department ladder truck. However, the wind threatened to scatter the volume, so they had to tape them together to keep a stack intact. It was an absurd feat, but it perfectly represented Jump's spirit, going big with enthusiasm and a touch of madness. While some question the purpose of it all, the answer was simple. That's exactly the point. Madness is fun. This slide is so on point because it reminds me how I got spoiled on Super Saiyan transformation as a kid. For all my old head Midwesterners from the US in here, y'all might remember the now defunct Kmart store. I remember going to one as a small kid and looking for Dragon Ball Z toys. I eventually found some, but something was so weird. Goku had yellow hair instead of black. I remember seeing this and was like, bro, what the F is a Super Saiyan? And not even buying it because I thought it was whack they didn't have the real Goku. Then in just a couple weeks, the faded episode with Frieza arrived and Goku with the weird hair now made perfect sense. Can't believe this article triggered a memory in me I forgot for so long. That means these problems with coordination have for real been going on for a hot minute. The same approach was reflected in the desire to engage fans, not just in reading manga, but also in playing with the characters. The editorial team spent many meetings figuring out what kids enjoyed outside of manga, and from these discussions, ideas like collectible cards and video games were born. The goal was to turn the Jump experience into something more interactive and enjoyable, expanding the world of the characters beyond the pages of the magazine. J-Wave Radio, Kosa Kosa. Interviewees being Kazuhiko Torishima, first Dragon Ball editor, Yu Kondo, second Dragon Ball editor, and Fuyuto Takeda, third Dragon Ball editor. And here's the last piece of the interview we're going over. So cool to me that they were already looking at the world of Jump as an entire universe, not just as a manga, because that's honestly what Jump has become. It's synonymous not just with manga or even really a specific product, but it honestly has gotten to a point where it evokes a feeling within you. When I think of Jump, I really do think about adventure, strength, friendship, overcoming adversity, and what a powerful thing to have your brain associated with. So in conclusion here, homies, thanks for coming on this ride. This interview has given me so much insight into Dragon Ball that I know I'll be thinking about this and the reveals for years to come. What Akira Toriyama brought into the world will never be replicated, and I consider it lucky and a blessing to have been brought into a world where I've gotten to experience his gifts as well as the teams he was surrounded by to bring that vision to life. Be easy out here, homies. Share the vid to put your homies on to the real lore of Dragon Ball. Subscribe to stay on top of the new and old vids alike, and I'll be catching you in the next one.